Have you ever noticed that there is something strange about Jesus' prayers? Since we were children, we were taught that he spoke to the Creator God, the same Yahweh of the Old Testament. But when you look carefully, when you really read his words without the filter of institutions and without the weight of altered translations, you realize something absurd. Jesus never prayed to the Creator God. He prayed to the Father, to the monad, to the absolute source, to the divine consciousness that exists beyond the material universe. And that changes everything. Everything about spirituality, what prayer is, and even who you are. Maybe you felt at some point in your life that praying felt more like a desperate plea than a real connection. As if you had to convince a distant being to listen to you, to save you, to help you. But Jesus never did that. He didn't beg for anything. He lined up. He declared. He thanked us before the demonstration. He spoke directly to absolute consciousness, not to the demiurge that shaped this imperfect world. And that's why his prayers worked, because they were codes of alignment, not rituals of dependency. And before we continue, let me ask you something. Comment below which city, state, or country you are watching this from now. I want to know how far this message is reaching, because it is one of those that awakens, shakes, and frees. And if you feel that shiver while listening, don't be scared. It's just your divine consciousness remembering who you really are. Now take a deep breath. Because what comes next will turn everything you've been told about Jesus, prayer, and connection with the Father upside down. When we look closely at Jesus' prayers, it becomes clear that he was not addressing the Creator God described in the Old Testament. Instead, he called to something much higher: the Father, the monad, the absolute source of consciousness. This Father was not a temperamental being who demanded sacrifices, but the divine consciousness itself that transcends the material universe. Jesus recognized this distinction and knew that praying was an act of direct connection with this infinite source, not a request to a limited entity. Jesus spoke to the Father as if he were speaking to something that is part of himself, not to an external figure. This is evident when he says phrases like "I and the Father are one," revealing that his prayer was not supplication, but alignment. This Father is the monad of Gnostic cosmology, the absolute consciousness that emanates everything and everyone within the pleroma. Unlike Yahweh described in ancient accounts, Jesus sought the pure divine source, free from human distortions. And that is why his prayer was so powerful. If you pay attention, you will see that Jesus' stance was never that of someone trying to convince a God to act. He simply expressed, declared, thanked in advance. This is because he did not relate to the God who created the material world, but to the supreme reality that exists before any creation. Jesus shows us that praying to the Father is returning to our own origin, recognizing our spiritual identity and accessing a level of Christic consciousness that transforms everything around. And realizing this paves the way to understanding the next point. The distinction between God and Father in the original Greek texts is one of those details that seem small but completely change the spiritual understanding of what Jesus taught. In the oldest manuscripts, when Jesus speaks to the Father, he uses pater, never the terms linked to the Creator God of the Old Testament. This shows that he was not repeating Jewish religious tradition, he was pointing to something greater, the source, the absolute consciousness that precedes all forms. Understanding this already begins to dismantle centuries of theological confusion. And this difference was not just linguistic, it was philosophical, energetic, existential. By speaking to the Father, Jesus was connecting with a monad, not with a tribal, jealous, or limited God. He knew that human consciousness needed to recognize its own divine origin in order to awaken, not remain trapped in fears, rituals, or intermediaries. This choice of words in the original Greek texts is like a little marker left by him, a reminder that the true spiritual path is internal, direct, and deep. When you realize this distinction, you begin to understand why so much has been softened, translated ambiguously, or even distorted over the centuries. If Jesus was teaching a direct connection to the source, this left out the need for institutions that controlled access to the sacred. And this, historically, has always been a problem for those who wanted power. The key here is simple: if you talk to the same Father that Jesus talked to, you reconnect with your own divine consciousness, and understanding this opens the door to the next point. In Gnostic cosmology, there is a fundamental difference between the monad and the demiurge, and understanding this distinction is like turning on a light in a room where you have lived your entire life in the dark. The monad is the absolute source, the pure, unlimited, silent, and eternal divine consciousness. The demiurge is a creative being, but not supreme, responsible for the formation of the material world, but limited in understanding and consciousness. This contrast appears in the Gnostic Gospels and explains why Jesus never treated Yahweh as his true Father. The demiurge, according to this ancient view, acts as an artisan of the physical cosmos, shaping matter, establishing laws, and imposing structures. But he is not the ultimate reality. He is not the origin of consciousness. This means that what many traditions call God may only be one part of the spiritual equation. Jesus pointed beyond this layer, seeking the monad, the pleroma, the absolute field where everything is one. And that is why his prayers had such a different tone, so expansive, so full of certainty. When you start to look at the world through this lens, you realize that a lot of what we were taught about spirituality has been oversimplified. Gnostic cosmology does not reject the existence of the demiurge, but it shows that he is not the top of the spiritual pyramid. It's like understanding that the hand that builds a house is not the same one that conceives the idea of the house. And this insight opens up space to understand why Jesus spoke of a Father who did not fit the Old Testament profile of divinity. The depth of this understanding sets the stage for the next point. When we look at Jesus' teachings in the light of Gnostic cosmology, it becomes very clear that he did not identify himself as a manifestation of the God of the Old Testament. On the contrary, Jesus saw himself as someone fully aligned with the monad, with the absolute and eternal consciousness. His famous statement, "I and the Father are one," is not a religious statement. It is a profound spiritual revelation. He recognized his unity with the Source and showed us that this same unity is possible for everyone. The material Creator God was not the focus of his mission. This realization changes the way we understand Jesus completely. Instead of a messenger from a God who demands obedience, he appears as someone who points inward, to the pleroma, to the Christic consciousness that sleeps in every human being. He did not come to reaffirm an ancient religious system. He came to show that true connection is direct, interior, and unbreakable. This is one of the reasons why many later religious traditions tried to fit him into molds that he never adopted. And when you understand that Jesus was unified with the monad, everything makes more sense: why he rejected empty practices, why he challenged religious authorities, and why he spoke with such authority. He did not speak of God. He spoke as one who knows the source. He did not quote laws. He expressed conscience. He did not represent an external divinity. He embodied an inner divine consciousness. And this key opens the way for us to understand how he prayed and why his prayers were so different. When we analyze the way Jesus prayed, we notice something surprising. He never adopted the posture of someone who is asking something from an external force. Instead, their prayers were declarations, affirmations of realities already manifested in divine consciousness. He spoke to the Father, the monad, as one who recognizes that everything already exists in the field of source, and that prayer is just an alignment with this truth. It was a practice of Christic consciousness, not religious supplication. Anticipatory gratitude is one of the most striking features of the way Jesus connected to the source. When he said, "I thank you for having already heard," he was demonstrating exactly this alignment with the pleroma, where everything is already potentially accomplished. Jesus' prayer came not from scarcity, but from certainty. He taught that conscience must position itself as someone who has already received, not as someone who depends on the goodwill of an external God. This completely changes the spiritual dynamic. And this style of prayer shows that Jesus understood manifestation as a natural process when we are connected to the monad. For him, there was no distance between intention and accomplishment. There was only inner clarity. That's why his actions had such an impact. He acted like someone who knew that source already sustained everything. When you begin to pray like this, you are not asking for something to happen, you are aligning yourself with what is already true at the level of absolute consciousness. And this leads us to look closely at the language he used. Jesus' language in prayer is so powerful that, when you pay attention, it seems almost impossible for anyone to interpret it as supplication. He used expressions of certainty, conviction, and oneness with Source. "No, if it is your will, or please answer me." On the contrary, he declared firmly, as one who knows the nature of divine consciousness. His prayer was an extension of his spiritual identity, not a negotiation with the universe. This reveals a Christ consciousness in action. Another striking point is anticipated gratitude, which appears several times in the Gnostic Gospels and in the Gospel of John himself. Jesus gives thanks before the miracle happens on the physical plane, because for him everything was already accomplished in the pleroma. This stance shows that he saw no separation between the spiritual and material worlds. Both were different expressions of the same absolute consciousness. Jesus' speech is that of someone who knows that the Father, the monad, is always present, always accessible. This language of certainty was also an invitation for people to awaken to their own divine origin. He said, "Do as I do," not to create an army of obedient followers, but to teach that anyone can access the same consciousness. Prayer, for him, was a way of remembering who you are, not of asking for what you lack. When you begin to understand Jesus' language, you realize that he was trying to elevate human consciousness, not create a new religion. And that brings us to the next point. Within the Gnostic vision, prayer was never understood as an act of asking something from a superior entity, but as a conscious alignment with the Source. And when you look at Jesus' teachings from this perspective, everything starts to make sense. He didn't teach people to beg for blessings, he taught them to remember who they were before they fell into the illusion of matter. For Gnostics, praying is returning to the inner pleroma, to the state of divine consciousness that has always been available. This means that Gnostic prayer functions more like an internal adjustment than a petition. It's like tuning into a radio station. The music is already there, you just need to align the dial. Jesus demonstrated this all the time. Instead of asking, he declared, affirmed, acknowledged. His words were vibrational codes that linked him to the monad, to the Absolute Father. And this practice completely transforms your relationship with the divine, because it takes you out of a position of lack and puts you in a position of unity. When you understand prayer as alignment, you begin to realize that it is not a request for something that is missing, but a return to what has always existed within you. This is one of the most powerful keys to the spiritual teachings that Jesus transmitted to his closest disciples, and which were later suppressed. He knew that by teaching this type of prayer, he was freeing people from intermediaries and rituals. And that's precisely where we start to get into the most uncomfortable part for religious authorities, which leads us to the next point. When we study the history of the early church and compare it with the oldest texts, it is evident that there was a deliberate effort to adjust translations, modify terms, and, in some cases, hide essential nuances of Jesus' teachings. And why? Because the idea of a direct connection with the monad without temples, without priests, without intermediaries completely threatened the power structure that was being built. Jesus' prayer, which was freedom, became dependence. The corruption of the texts was not just a matter of innocent translation errors, it was often a way of redirecting spirituality onto a more manageable path. Expressions that indicated unity with Source were softened. Terms that highlighted divine consciousness were replaced by more religious concepts. The distinction between Father and Creator God, so clear in the Gnostic Gospels, almost completely disappeared in official texts. This erasure shaped centuries of beliefs. And when you understand this process, you realize that Jesus was teaching something much deeper than what was institutionalized. He wasn't building a religion, he was dissolving the illusions that kept people trapped. Prayer, for him, was a return to the pleroma, not a ritual of submission. The Church, in altering these teachings, has not just changed words, it has changed the way millions of people understand the divine itself. And this break in perception guides us to the next point, where we will see what original Gnosticism really taught. Original Gnosticism defended a simple and deeply liberating idea: the connection with the source, with the monad, is direct and inherent to the human being. You don't need temples, authority figures, or rituals that authorize you to speak to the divine. Jesus, by teaching this, was giving back to people something that was always theirs: divine consciousness. He showed that each individual is an extension of the source, and that true spirituality is born from within, not from external structures. This view contrasts sharply with the notion of a religion centered on a God that requires obedience and intermediaries to access. For the Gnostics, spiritual experience was an inward journey, a remembering of who we truly are before the layers of conditioning. Jesus reinforced this when he said to enter the secret room, symbolizing the internal space where connection happens. He talked about identity, not religious hierarchy. And this message was so powerful and so dangerous for those seeking control that official traditions made a point of burying this vision. But it survived in the Gnostic Gospels and in the memory of those who kept alive the idea that we are fragments of absolute consciousness. When you understand that the source is within you, the entire spiritual dynamic changes. And this understanding paves the way for us to analyze the texts that reveal this truth more clearly. The Gnostic Gospels, such as Jude's, Thomas, and John's Apocrypha, bring a completely different view of Jesus' relationship with prayer and the divine. In these texts, he appears teaching a direct connection with the monad, showing that true spiritual understanding does not go through rituals, but through internal awakening. In the Gospel of Thomas, for example, Jesus speaks of inner light, of the consciousness that is already within the human being, and this changes the way we understand prayer. The Gospel of Judas goes even further by showing Jesus explaining the difference between the Creator God and the true Father, revealing that many people worshipped inferior entities believing they were supreme. The Apocryphon of John describes the entire Gnostic cosmology, detailing the pleroma, the monad, and the demiurge that shaped the material world. These texts reveal a spiritual practice based on awareness, not fear. And they show that Jesus knew exactly what he was praying for when he prayed. When you come across these works, you realize that they do not contradict Jesus, they clarify what has been lost. The way he prayed only makes sense when we understand this expanded cosmology. Without this, everything becomes a limited reading, where Jesus seems to follow the same religious standards that he often questioned. The Gnostic Gospels are like missing pieces of a puzzle, and open the way for us to understand what he really wanted to convey about our divine origin. And that brings us to the next point. When Jesus said "Our Father," or stated "I and the Father are one," he was not using religious metaphors. He was describing a profound spiritual reality: we all originate from the monad, the absolute source of consciousness. This paternity is neither biological nor theological, it is existential. It means that the same divine consciousness that sustained Jesus also sustains each human being. For him, prayer was the act of remembering this origin and returning to the state of unity with the source. These statements appear repeatedly in Gnostic and even canonical texts, but have been reinterpreted over the centuries as figures of speech or religious doctrine. However, Jesus spoke of spiritual identity, of essence. He showed that the Father was not distant, nor separated, nor on a throne. The Father was within, at the core of being, as the divine consciousness that precedes the material world shaped by the demiurge. This is the key to understanding his method of prayer. When we realize this common origin, spiritual practice stops being an effort to please an external entity and becomes a process of internal awakening. Jesus tried to show this simply: the kingdom is within you. He did not say this as a poetic metaphor, but as a spiritual technology. Recognizing that everyone originates from the monad changes the way you pray, act, and perceive life. And this understanding opens up space to analyze the specific method he used in manifestation. When we observe Jesus' method of prayer, we realize that he used a technique that today we would call conscious manifestation. But, unlike modern versions, his practice was entirely based on Christ consciousness and union with the monad. He didn't try to create something out of nothing. It aligned with what already existed in the absolute source. His posture always reflected certainty, not doubt. Jesus knew that spiritual reality is primary and that the material world is only its expression. This vision becomes clear when he performs healings or multiplications. There is no hesitation, no trying, no anxiety. He simply declares, thanks, and acts. It is as if he is reminding the universe of who he is, and the universe responds. This technique did not depend on rituals, but on identity. When you recognize yourself as an expression of divine consciousness, your words gain power because they are aligned with the truth of the pleroma. Jesus was a master at this, and his actions demonstrated this unity in an indisputable way. Understanding Jesus' method allows you to transform the way you pray and manifest your intentions. Instead of asking, you align. Instead of pleading, you affirm. Instead of seeking outside, you return within. This is the central point of Christ consciousness. Manifesting is a natural consequence of being connected to the monad. This is why Jesus said to do greater things than himself, not as a challenge, but as a reminder of the divine capacity that exists within each person. And this insight leads us to the next point. When we talk about the 5 steps to praying like Jesus, we are talking about a practice that goes far beyond beautiful words or repeated formulas. It is a spiritual technology based on divine consciousness, in alignment with the monad. The first step is simple but challenging. Don't ask. Jesus never asked because he knew that asking reinforces the idea of separation and scarcity. When you ask, you are telling Source that you don't have it yet, and that keeps you from manifesting. He showed that prayer begins by recognizing that everything is already available in absolute consciousness. The second step is to align yourself. This means adjusting your internal state to vibrate at the same frequency as what you want to manifest. Jesus did this naturally because he lived anchored in Christ consciousness. For us, this alignment can begin with breathing, silence, meditation, or simply observation. The third step is the famous declaration I am, which is not a motivational phrase, it is an identity code. When you say I am, you are connecting to the same essence that he accessed, the divine consciousness that creates and sustains everything. The fourth step is to silence, not in the sense of shutting up, but in the sense of quieting the mind. It is in silence that the connection with the pleroma becomes clearer, and it is in silence that the Source speaks. The fifth step is to recognize that the manifestation has already happened on the spiritual level, even before it appears on the physical plane. Jesus thanked him before seeing, because he understood this perfectly. This sequence creates a bridge between you and the monad, and turns prayer into a process of conscious creation. Now that we understand the method, we are ready for the most controversial point. The idea that the religious God, especially the Yahweh of the Old Testament, was not the supreme God has always been an uncomfortable topic for religious institutions, but it is extremely clear in Gnostic texts. For these teachings, Yahweh is merely the demiurge, the architect of the material, limited, emotional, and deeply imperfect world. Jesus knew this and, therefore, never addressed him as Father. His Father was the monad, the absolute consciousness, the source beyond any form or duality. This difference is crucial. The demiurge acts as a ruler who demands obedience, creates strict laws and severe punishments. The monad, on the other hand, does not order, does not punish, does not separate, it only emanates. While the religious creator God behaves as an authority figure, the divine source is pure intelligence, presence, and consciousness. Jesus, by connecting with the true Father, was freeing himself from the narrow and anthropomorphic view of divinity. He invited people to transcend it too. When you understand this distinction, many passages light up in a new way. Jesus' loving stance would never align with the violence attributed to the tribal God of the Old Testament. His teachings were of expansion, not control, of freedom, not of servitude, of divine consciousness, not of fear. This revelation is transformative, because it shows that true spirituality is not born from fear, but from union with the source. And this understanding paves the way for the last point. Jesus' final message, when observed without the filters of institutionalized religion, is profoundly simple and profoundly revolutionary. You are the monad experiencing yourself. This means that divine consciousness is not outside, nor above, nor distant. It is the core of your existence. Jesus didn't want followers, he wanted them awake. By teaching that the kingdom is within you, he was revealing that true prayer is an act of recognition, not supplication. It's remembering that the source already lives in you. When you understand this, the entire spiritual structure changes. Prayer stops being a request and becomes a mirror. A mirror in which you look and say, I am part of absolute consciousness. Jesus encouraged people to see this truth, because he knew that when someone awakens to their spiritual identity, nothing can imprison them. Neither fear, nor guilt, nor doctrines. This is the essence of Christ consciousness, the realization that we are living extensions of the pleroma. And that is why the practice of praying like Jesus does not depend on formulas, temples, or intermediaries. It depends only on an internal gesture remembering who you are. When you honor yourself as a manifestation of the divine source, everything changes your way of living, acting, and manifesting. Jesus reminded us that the Father is not far away. The Father is the very consciousness that you carry. And understanding this ends this journey perfectly, preparing you to integrate everything into real life. Now that you've gone through this journey and reconnected so many threads that have been cut, the question that really matters is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Because understanding that Jesus prayed to the monad, that the source is within you, and that divine consciousness is your true identity, this is not information to keep in a drawer. It is an invitation to live differently. An invitation to transform every prayer into alignment, every thought into creation, and every feeling into manifestation. So take a deep breath and ask yourself, what would your life be like if you started, today, to pray like Jesus prayed? If instead of asking, you declared? If instead of fearing, you recognized? If instead of looking outside, you turned inside? And most importantly, what would change in the way you see yourself, knowing that you are a direct part of absolute consciousness? These questions are not rhetorical, they are portals. And only you can cross them. If this message touched you, if it opened a crack of light within you, I invite you to go further. Leave here in the comments what most awakened your conscience today. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes. We're just getting started. There's a lot more about prayer, divine consciousness, and the hidden teachings of Jesus coming.